What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Unlock Your Potential. I'm your host, Francesco Bartolillo, and today I got a really exciting solo episode for you. For anybody who was listening from the start of this podcast, at the very beginning, I kind of said how I wanted to do a couple solo episodes, whether that's once a week or every couple weeks, where I dissect and just share some kind of golden nuggets from some of the podcasts that I listen to on a regular basis. So today's going to be the first episode that we do that. I've got 3 podcasts that I listened to this week that I thought there were some really good little snippets from it that I want to share, and hopefully that entices you to maybe listen to that podcast, or maybe it saves you the time of listening to the podcast because maybe you just don't have the time to listen to multiple podcasts a week, and hopefully you can just take those little golden snippets that I found and apply them to your own life. And so the podcast we have for today's episode are, one's based around health, the other is based around kind of lifestyle and just leadership. And so some can be related to business. So there's a whole bunch of different kind of, themes for today's episode. It's not just one theme that we're going to stick with like we normally do when we have guests on the episode. So I think there's a little bit of something for everyone. And I will be linking the episodes in the description. So if you hear, a little piece that you're like, oh, that sounds interesting to me, you can actually go ahead and watch those episodes. They're all from fantastic podcasters, pretty famous ones. So, a lot of you may have heard of them already. So, hopefully you find some useful stuff in that. So let's get started. So the first podcast that we're going to talk about today is an episode from On Purpose with Jay Shetty. This is probably one of the very first podcasts I really started listening to religiously. Jay Shetty, for anybody who doesn't know, is the author of Think Like a Monk. He's kind of world renowned for, spirit, mind, well-being. His podcast is, I believe, the number 1 health podcast in the world. And he has some incredible guests on it, like the one from today's episode that we're going to talk about, which was... it was released on March 18th, so just a little bit over a week ago, and it was featuring Jessie Inchospe, and I probably butchered her last name there, but she's also known as the Glucose Goddess. And so essentially the focus of this episode was having this specialist who comes on and talks about the effects of glucose on your body, in particularly glucose spikes and how negative they are for you. So in the episode early on, basically she outlines some of the negative impacts of glucose spikes, which includes aging. It affects your cravings, it affects your energy levels, it affects your sleep, your skin. For people with diabetes, it can actually have a huge negative impact on diabetes. So all these really, really negative impacts from the glucose spikes that you encounter throughout the day. And so the podcast episode focuses on some of the tricks and tips you can do to help avoid those spikes, or minimize their frequency or how severe they are. And I'm going to share some of the little tips and tricks that she shared in that episode, and then hopefully that might entice you to want to go and listen and get some more details. And I'm going to preface this by saying in the podcast, she repeated multiple times that she never tells anybody they have to stop doing something or they can't do something. She recognized that we're all humans and we all have habits and we all have moments of weakness and we all have cravings, and that's normal. And she doesn't advocate for cutting out sugar entirely out of your diet unless that's something you want to do. But it's just the idea of how do we get better? How do we improve? So the first one that she talked about that basically said one of the most important things you can do is shifting from a sweet to a savory breakfast. And I kind of felt like this one was targeted at me directly because I probably have one of the worst breakfasts when it comes to sweet versus savory. And honestly, it was without even knowing. So the sweet breakfast is the typical, maybe it's the pancakes with syrup, maybe it's the waffles, even the yogurt that's not Greek yogurt, that's high in sugar, with the granola, which is terrible for you. All these things are really high in sugars, and they're going to cause glucose spikes. But the reason the breakfast part of this is so important is because you've just finished a fast, meaning you've slept for, most people have slept 7, 8, 9 hours, plus your previous meal before going to bed was likely a couple hours before that. So you're on 10, 12 plus hours without anything in your body. And the first thing you're putting in your body is then glucose. And what that does is your body's super vulnerable in that moment, and it causes this glucose spike. And that sets you on a roller coaster for the rest of the day. Because then all of a sudden, a couple hours later, you start to get that craving. So then you have a snack that's likely high in glucose. Then you eat your lunch, and boom, again, you have another glucose spike. And then you hit that crash later in the afternoon, and you're tired. And this roller coaster just goes on and on and on all day. And it affects how you feel throughout the day. It affects your energy levels. It's going to affect your sleep that night. It just has a ton of negative impact. And so instead, she recommends you go for a savory breakfast. Start your day off with something, high protein, maybe high fiber. She talks about, things that we don't traditionally consider breakfast food. So she'll say she has maybe leftover fish from the night before with maybe some eggs. And if you're gonna do the yogurt path, go for a nice Greek yogurt. And if you want that little bit of sweetness, use the whole fruits. And she really emphasized that the benefit of the whole fruit is that it has the protective fiber attached to it. And so if you're using whole fruits, then okay, you have the yogurt with a little bit of whole fruit, maybe it gives a little bit of sweetness, that sort of thing. So it's just finding better alternatives early in the morning, especially as your first meal of the day. It sets you up for the rest of the day. So that was one key element. Just touching on that whole fruit piece, because this is something, again, that I thought was really interesting, was she talks about the reason why whole fruits are so important in comparison to, juices or even smoothies is when you're juicing or blending a fruit, it actually takes away or pulverizes the fiber. And essentially now it's just a spike waiting to happen. So these fruit juices, these fruit smoothies, you're taking away the protective layer from the fruit and now just basically removing it and having all this glucose, this sugar. And so try to avoid those things, especially early in the morning. The second one that I wanted to note was when you're eating, so at this point, hopefully we're talking lunch and dinner because hopefully you've had that savory breakfast. The order in which you eat the food is super important. It actually has a huge impact on the glucose spikes and the glucose levels. So if you're having a meal that has, your protein, your veggies, and then your carbs, the order in which you eat these will actually affect how the glucose reacts with your body. And so what you want to do is you want to start with your veggies. You want to start with that fiber, because what it's going to do is it's going to coat your stomach. It's going to give you that protective layer, which then prepares your body to digest and deal with the incoming food. You want to then follow that up with your protein, and then you want to finish off with your carbs. So it's not saying you can't have a nice plate of pasta for dinner. What it's saying is you want to have your veggies first, and then maybe that piece of chicken or meat or whatever you're having, that protein, and then have your pasta. And what it's going to do is that is going to mitigate the impact of the carbs and of the glucose in those carbs. So it's going to give you, a dulled glucose spike, if any at all. And so I just thought that was a very interesting piece because, for me, coming from my background, Italian background, traditionally, if we went to an Italian restaurant, we would actually start with a salad or something like that, an antipasto, something that's actually going to help you digest. And then you would go on to your pasta or whatever it is. But, in your home, often it's like, okay, let's get that plate of pasta on the table. And then if you have room after, you'll have some veggies or whatever. And so we've actually gone backwards a little bit. And it's important to recognize why those things are in place, why you should have those veggies first, because it's really helping protect your body. As well, there's a couple other interesting little snippets from this podcast that I really wanted to share. One was there's some little hacks you can also do if you know you're going to be, having a snack that has glucose or having a high carb meal. One of those is actually taking a tablespoon of vinegar and putting that in a glass of water. And just drinking that 5-10 minutes before your meal. And what that's going to do is that's actually going to help reduce the impact of the glucose and reduce the level of that glucose spike or mitigating it entirely. Another is just, she calls it dressing up your snacks, meaning, if you're going to have something that is high in glucose, high in sugars, then pair it with something else, So if you're going to have some granola, let's say, then make sure you're pairing that with a nice Greek yogurt, that sort of thing. If you're going to have maybe, let's say you're going to have a piece of bread, then maybe pair that, with some avocado and something that's going to, again, it's going to dress up your carbs a little bit, and it's going to give you a little bit more of that other stuff that's going to help fight against those glucose spikes. So yeah, and then the last one that I thought was really interesting and was kind of terrifying for me to do, which was, she says that if the sugar on the ingredient list for your food, like for whatever you're eating, a granola bar, a packet of oatmeal, whatever it is, if sugar is in the first 5 ingredients, she actually considers that dessert. And so, I challenge anybody listening to go and grab some of your favorite snacks, go grab some of your frequent food that you eat on a regular basis, and just look and see how often you see sugar showing up in those first 5 ingredients, because that means sugar is a key component of whatever that is. And for me, it was a big learning curve, just grabbing certain things that I eat on a regular basis and realizing, wow, there's a lot of sugar in my diet that I could be removing by simply going towards a savory alternative. So that was the first one. Again, that was On Purpose with Jay Shetty. Episode was from March 18th, featuring Jesse Inchospe. Again, for sure butchered that last name. We'll move on to the second podcast. And this one was actually a little bit of an older podcast, but I just kind of came back to listening to it. I listened to it a while back, and I wanted to, listen to it again just because it was one of my favorites. And this is Diary of a CEO, and it was featuring Simon Sinek, and this was back in May 2022. I have a lot of enjoyment listening to Simon Sinek. I think he's great in all facets of life, not just business, but in leadership, in relationships, in well-being, mental health. I think he's got some great stuff to share. Diary of a CEO is one of my favorite podcasts because Stephen Bartlett just has on so many incredible guests. And so I highly recommend checking this one out. Not necessarily just this episode, but in general, go check out Diary of a CEO. And so there was one thing in this podcast that really stuck out to me that I really wanted to bring forward. And this was the idea of basically having outcome or arbitrary goals versus infinite goals. This is something that we've talked about in the past. We've talked about the infinite game and how if you don't have an outcome goal, but rather just view life, view sports, view business, view relationships as this infinite game where you're constantly trying to improve and get better and grow, you're better off than having these outcome goals. But basically in this episode, what they do is they actually talk about how when you have these arbitrary goals, these outcome goals, when they use athletes as an example, so I'll just stick with that kind of path. You spend, your whole life training, preparing, trying to achieve whatever this goal is. And often we see athletes at the highest levels will go on to then achieve those goals. And as soon as they do, it's almost like followed by this crash. And they actually use the example of Michael Phelps. As soon as he broke the record for most gold medals, within a week, he openly said that he had faced full-on depression. So at the pinnacle of this individual's career, pretty much achieved everything you can in his respective sport. And at a point where most people would think he's at this absolute high, he's facing depression. And it's because when you set these outcome and these arbitrary goals and you get there and you expect that feeling is just going to last forever and you realize it doesn't and you realize that's all there is, it's a really sinking feeling. And it's that same idea I've talked about in the past and other conversations where it's like, it's kind of that idea that you get to the mountaintop and once you're there, you realize, well, this is it. Or again, even worse, you realize I'm at the mountaintop and I'm surrounded by other mountains that are even taller and even bigger. And I have to go climb those ones now. And so you set these outcome goals for yourself, and then you get to wherever your outcome is, and you realize, yeah, I've been focusing on this, thinking this was going to fix everything, and it's not. And it's the same idea for business or for personal. If you're, I'm going to make $1 million and then I'm going to be happy, or I'm going to get that job that pays me $100,000 a year and then I'm going to be happy, and you start to realize that these arbitrary things are not the solution. These kind of outcome-based goals are not the things that are going to provide you with happiness and continued happiness. It doesn't mean that you won't be happy for a brief moment. And for some people, maybe they do experience it and it's all they need. But for a lot of people, it's you can set these goals to drive you and motivate you, but you have to understand that this cannot be your only goal. This cannot be your only outcome, because as soon as you do achieve it, then what? And a lot of people don't know what comes after that. And that's a scary thought, especially for athletes. So to a lot of the athletes out there listening, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't have these goals. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't set goals and objectives to try and achieve. It's that you have to understand that that's just one element. That's just one element of who you are and what you do. And it's everything else that's surrounded by it. And it's the journey and the process that you have to enjoy, because otherwise you're doing all this work to get something that's gone just in the snap of a finger. So that was the big takeaway from that episode. They go all over the map in that episode, just talking about a bunch of different things. But for me, it hit home a lot when he talked about, again, like I said, Michael Phelps, one of the most elite athletes of all time. Just, as soon as they achieved the highest goal possible, instantly depression, sadness, and that sort of thing. It doesn't mean that everybody who achieves these incredible goals is going to feel that way. It just goes to show that the outcome goal is not necessarily going to bring you that, and you have to find it in multiple different ways, not just one area of life. The final episode that I want to talk about today, again, another podcast I listened to, Chris Williamson, Modern Wisdom. Again, this is Chris Williamson has blown up over the last probably 2 years, has some incredible guests on this podcast. A lot of, whether that's the world of health, business, sports, kind of all different areas. And for this episode, which was on March 23rd, so just a couple days ago from me recording this episode, he had Noah Kagan on the show, which is a very successful entrepreneur, multimillionaire, might even be a billionaire, like super successful individual. And they talked a lot about the entrepreneurial journey and, how you succeed in businesses and regrets that a lot of business people have. And I think actually the title of the episode might even be like regrets billionaires have. So really cool, fascinating episode to hear from such a successful individual having a conversation with another very successful individual. And the little snippet that I wanted to talk about was for any of I want to say entrepreneurs out there, but it's not even true. It's really for anybody out there. And it's, they have this segment where they're talking about, as time progresses, you get better and it gets easier. And that's the highest return. So the beginning of anything requires the most amount of energy, requires the most effort, with the smallest return. And basically they're trying to hit home on this kind of stick with it factor, like the don't give up factor, because imagine you're starting a business or you're learning a sport for the first time or whatever it is. The beginning of that adventure, of that journey, that requires the most amount of effort. Like when you're starting a business for the first time, you have to learn how to run a business. You have to learn how to do the marketing. You have to recruit people. You have to hire. You have to learn the social media. You have to, there's just so much that comes to starting a business. And even if you want to, zoom in and make it really narrow, let's say you are a content creator. And the first video you create, it takes so much time because you have to understand how a camera works. You have to understand settings. You have to learn how to use an editor. You have to make a bunch of mistakes. Like the beginning just requires the most amount of energy. And then what happens is you make that first video and you post it and you get 27 views. And it's like, all that work for that. And then what they're saying is basically the better you get, the more you do something, the more you stick with it, your quality increases, the ease of which you can do it increases. So you get better at making videos, you get better at editing, the settings. Therefore, the quality of your video is better. So it takes less time and less effort. And by the time you get to that point, you've grown a following, you've created a network, people have seen your quality increases, so it gets shared more. And now that same, that video that took you 4 hours before to create now takes you 45 minutes, and instead of 27 views, you're getting 2,700 views. And so they just basically talk about that, and they talk about how as business individuals who are very successful, they've seen in their own businesses now that, this late in their careers, which they're now multimillionaires and very successful, it comes with so much ease, and the making money part for them, for example, is super easy. They just know the processes, they know how it works, they know the operations, and they can do it very quickly. But if they didn't stick with it from the start, they would never have got to that point. Again, so the reason I wanted to bring this up was, again, for my entrepreneurs out there, for my athletes, for anybody really, just that ability to stick with it when it requires the most energy and you see the smallest reward. That's the toughest part, but that's the part you got to get through. Because as soon as you can push through that, if you can keep going, if you can not give up, and you can get to the point where you've mastered it and creation becomes easy and training becomes easy and all these different things, you're also going to reap the benefits tenfold, 20-fold, 100-fold, because you're now an expert and you've done all the work to get there. So basically just don't give up before the magic happens. Give yourself a chance to go through the grind. Don't quit. And allow yourself to become, an expert in that field, and then you really get to see the benefits from doing that. So those are the three episodes. Again, I will link them into the podcast description. I hope there's some snippets in there for you guys. Again, I thought there was a lot of really interesting pieces from all three podcasts. These are just kind of the quick ones that I wanted to do takeaways from. If there's anything else that you find in there, I would love to hear, love to share with me. You have me on all the platforms. I hope today will help you unlock your potential. As always, we'll see you guys next time.